All right, so class, today we're going to look at the basic panel, which is going to be where you're going to do the majority of your processing on your images. So this is going to let you modify the exposure, kind of isolate your highlights and whites, your color saturation, dehazing, adds more texture, clarity, and mess around with your contrast. So this is where you're going to refine your image. So I picked an image to work from, and these were shot with a macro lens. So sometimes I shot a numerous ones of each just to make sure. It's sometimes focusing with a macro lens, it's extremely challenging. So looking at this image, I'm going to reset to make sure that it's neutral here. So whenever I am adjusting my photographs, I always have my histogram open. I always take a look at the histogram before I start. Many times when students, as I mentioned in the histogram, when you are just doing it by your eye, you're often not processing your image correctly. So you, again, just want to make sure that you always have detail in your highlights and detail in your shadows and information in the blacks and whites. And it doesn't have to be a ton in the blacks and whites, but you want to have the full spectrum. So this image actually, just from the start, looks pretty good. I have information in my highlight area, my whites, and my shadows, and my blacks. And all that's good. Now you will notice, and this is something that is a little bit more advanced, but you'll notice that there is mainly just a blue ramp in my whites, which means that perhaps my color temperature is off. So there is a blue cast across the whole image, and this is kind of flagging that for me here. So I'm going to try, as I am processing these images, to kind of clean that up a little bit. I am going to collapse my histogram for now, and I'll be opening it back and forth. Normally I always just have it open and using it as a resource, but I want you to be able to see the full basic panel. So in the basic panel, the first thing that you're going to come to is a treatment. So you can leave your images in color. Most DSLRs photograph solely in, or the user photographs them in color. You can set your camera to photograph monochromatic. Most people don't. There are some fine art photographers for real specific reasons, like infrared photographers, that will modify their camera body so it shoots in infrared, and then they have to set their cameras, or they will set their cameras to black and white. But whenever you shoot in color, you can also, just by clicking treatment, you can go ahead and switch that to black and white. It does not, just remember, everything in Lightroom are just settings, so nothing is permanent. So I can just go ahead and click color and go back and forth between those. And I'm going to do that a couple times to show you what that does. So under profile, this is another place where you can switch it to monochromatic or back to color. Now here's my white balance, and currently it is set to shot. You can also choose auto, and you can see right now, I'm going to go back up and twirl open my histogram. It did shift some of that color, and I have a little bit less blue in my highlights now. There's more of a ramp of all of the colors in the white area. It's still got a bit of a blue cast, but it corrected that for me. So I can do that. I usually don't use auto. I'm going to go back as shot. I'm going to be using my temperature and tint to correct this. Now, in color, because photography, we are dealing with the science of light, we are going to be looking at red, green, and blue as our primary colors. We have 3 cones in our eyes, 3 types of cones in our eyes. One that perceives red light, one that perceives blue light, and one that perceives green light. So the opposite of blue in the color spectrum, or the complement of it, is yellow. So if I add blue, I'm taking away yellow. If I'm adding yellow, I'm taking away blue. If I am adding green, I'm taking away magenta. If it's magenta, I'm really taking away green, so I can see the magenta layer, which is the same way blue works. So I'm adding blue, I'm seeing more blue, I'm taking away the blue, it's revealing yellow. So I think I had mentioned that there are 3 color temperatures. So if there's 3 different colors, cones in our eyes. So what about the red? So if I take away blue and I can actually add red into it by mixing the yellow and magenta together. So I'm going to just play around with my color temperature right now, and I'm going to add a little warmth there, and I might add a little magenta to just kind of like warm it up a touch more. So if I twirl open my histogram now, you'll see that that's really, my whites are really starting to fix themselves. This is a much better histogram for when I'm looking and using my histogram not only for value but also to kind of figure out if there are color casts that I need to remove. So Otto did an okay job, and this is what I'm going to be selling to you. Otto does an okay job, but if you know how to read the histogram and use the different panels, you can do a much better job than any automatic function inside of really any of the Adobe products. So presets are great, but doing it yourself and being knowledgeable about what the tools do is often much, much better. So going back at the exposure, I'm going to pop down, so when I start looking at my tone of my prints, first thing I'm going to come to is my exposure. Ideally, you're going to have a proper exposure in camera, just like your design and your composition should be a good design and composition in camera, and you shouldn't be cropping too much inside of Lightroom. And we'll talk about that in a different video. But when I'm looking at my histogram, as we mentioned at the beginning, this does have a proper exposure because I have whites to blacks. But if I wanted to modify this at all, maybe shift it to a brighter side, that's still, that's giving me some creative flexibility here because it was shot properly. If it wasn't shot properly, I wouldn't be able to do this. So if I didn't have a proper exposure in the camera, I wouldn't be able to modify it as much in Lightroom. Now, I will mention all of these things that we're going to be covering initially. When I see a lot of students first use these panels, they will make huge jumps. And you want to take things incrementally. These should be minor shifts that you're doing, not major shifts. So start off a little bit. Now, with some exceptions, you might be able to kind of go big with your contrast. So, but we'll talk about contrast in a minute. So little shifts. You want to get it as close to correct as possible in camera so you don't have to do as much in post-production. So when I'm talking about contrast, we want to look at the histogram together and compare it to what texture and clarity do. And look at this very carefully. So I am going to do big shifts here. So if I move to the right, I'm increasing the contrast. And notice that I lose a lot of mid-tone here, and I'm pushing everything that is from the center right over towards the highlights and the center left over to the shadows. And so it is really taking all of those midtones and putting them in one camp or the other. Now, if I do the opposite and go to the left and I'm making it a low contrast image, you'll see the ramp, it's pushing everything from the highlight and the shadow center, and you're getting a much flatter looking image with a big ramp of midtones and not a whole lot of highlight and shadows. So again, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to your histogram to make the proper decision here, but this is also this is a very different mood image than this image, right? So one's feeling really soft, the other one's kind of hard and contrasty. So we're gonna look now at what clarity does in contrast to the contrast tool. So they do very different things, and oftentimes people get them mixed up if they're just looking at them visually. And the histogram, again, helps us to understand it a little bit better. So I just want you to remember what a high contrast image looks like here. I'm going to neutralize that. And then we're going to look at clarity. I'm going to increase my clarity. And look at what the histogram is doing. And as I'm bringing my histogram up, you'll notice that it's flattening out in the center a little bit, but it's getting kind of spikier looking across, like it's almost like it's getting more furry. That's because what clarity does is it's trying to make the image look sharper. So it's finding pixels that are light and dark that are butted up together, and it is creating more contrast in those in specific areas, and it's not affecting the histogram quite the same, where it's moving giant camps of value. It's finding those areas within the photograph where there are highlight and shadows butted up and creating more texture or creating more clarity or a sense that it is a sharper image. It's not actually, you can't change optics. If your image was shot out of focus, it is out of focus, but you can take an image that and make it appear that it is a little crisper than it was actually if by bumping up the clarity. The texture is even more minute. It is making even more localized adjustments where it's finding even smaller areas and focusing on that. And you can see as I'm moving my texture up, these areas that were very sharp and in focus are becoming higher contrast, and they look like they have more texture. So from contrast being a very large swath, it's working in values that are across the entire image, where clarity is looking for big areas of contrast and highlight that it can make more contrasty. And then texture is really the most micro. So those are the ones that you can use to kind of create more oomph or a little bit more interest in your images. Now, if I bring my clarity and texture down, you can see that the image, it's nice to see what things do by their opposite. So here's texture with texture all the way up. So those areas that were highly textured in the first place are popping out more. You're seeing more blacks and more highlights in those areas. But if I bring those down, all of that's flattening out and it looks softer. So let's say you were photographing, you're doing a portrait of someone. You might bring your texture down on purpose if they have maybe some blemishes and things like that that are just kind of more generalized across the face to help soften that. Where clarity, bringing clarity up, you can see the whole image is getting a little higher key with, lines of highlight and shadow becoming more contrasty. And then if I bring my clarity down, it actually does look fuzzier because you're making fuzzier lines between those contrast areas, those lines of contrast. So this tends to be your contrast and texture are kind of an aesthetic choice. These are preferences that you might want. You can utilize them to fix things, or you can utilize them to just to create a different visual appearance to your image. Now, contrast is something that is both a preference and technical. This can help you solve some problems with your images that are too flat or too high key. So if it's too high key, I'll bring my contrast down. If it's too flat, I might increase my contrast, and that will help the histogram get that proper blacks to highlights. Now, I can isolate just my highlights or just my whites. Remember, your highlights are those areas of textured whites, so I can make those darker or I can make those brighter. And that tends to be a bigger swath but it really depends on the image. So there are my whites. And so that's kind of a more of a major change because I'm actually shifting my highlight point, look at the histogram, from one end to the other. Where when I'm dealing with my highlights, it's really just affecting that one segment in here. And shadows do the same thing. So just being on the opposite end, creating a little bit more depth in my shadows or brightening up my shadows versus really shifting the entire histogram over with my blacks and making the image darker, but still holding that highlight point. So it's a little different from, your exposure. It's very different from your exposure. Okay, so we've talked about exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. Dehaze. I'm going to scroll down here and see if I can find some images that were shot in the water. So dehaze is supposed to be a tool that you use to cut down on reflection and to be able to, oftentimes there's a cast with when you shoot in water or shoot a reflection in glass, and if that cast that you have can be removed using dehaze. You do need to be careful when using this because it can make your image kind of start breaking apart and get polarized or posterized. So I'm going to go 1-to-1 here so you can see the image. Well, it's not working right now. There we go. I still had my color dropper. So when I take dehaze, I want you to look at this blue area in here. When things get posterized, it will start chunking up areas and it will look pixelated, and that's not ideal. And it's actually not doing it too badly here. And again, that is from, it might be doing it more up there. The reason why it is not doing that as much is because it was properly exposed. And I'm going to keep hammering this point to you all throughout the term. The better your original image is, the more flexibility you're going to have in the back end. So that's what dehaze does. It just removes that cast. This is the original. You can see it looks like it has a fuzz over it. And then if I remove that, but if I wanted to add that, if I wanted to make the image kind of ethereal or more abstract, I might actually add dehaze. So that is a creative choice. So we are going to look at vibrance, and I'll just stay on this image or maybe I'll go, this one's got a little bit more color to it. So, and I'm going to neutralize this. So this is what it was originally shot. This is just some plants that were photographed in the water. So vibrance and saturation look very similar, but they do work that's kind of, I would say, connected the same way that contrast and clarity are connected. So I can take my vibrance all the way up, and it's making my colors look more saturated. Kind of similar to what saturation does. So they both look like the colors are getting brighter, more saturated, maybe more pure to like camps of yellow or camps of red color. But if I bring my vibrance down, you'll notice that it's doing things that are very different from saturation. Vibrance is going to hold your color tone and your tonal, and it'll hold your tonal integrity a little bit better, and it really only affects colors that are already saturated. So I'm going to go into this image because it actually might show this better. So if I bring my vibrance down, notice that his red shirt and this kayak still has some color associated with it. But if I were, and I'm going to bring it all the way down, just to make sure, and so there's still some color present there. But if I do that with saturation, this turns into a black and white image. So if I bring my color up, notice everything gets more high key. So saturation is more global, where notice that the blue is really getting affected and the red is getting affected more. But this neutral shirt in the image isn't getting any more color to it, where in the saturation you'll see that there's more yellow present in there. So they do things that are visually different, so you want to make sure. I typically use vibrance more than saturation because that it is more specific to the areas that it affects. So that is your basic panel. Enjoy and have fun.